The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to this SPR webinar. The SPR Webinar Organizational Committee is very happy to host yet another webinar in our series. My name is Alex Vaz, and I'll be your host for today. Before welcoming our presenter for today's talk, I'd like to extend my congratulations and a warm welcome to Juan Cruz Curati and Natalie Potsmith, as they will be taking over as the new hosts and coordinators for our SPR webinar series. So congratulations and thanks to Juan and Natalie, and I look forward to enjoying all the great content ahead. Today's webinar will be held by Dr. Orya Tishby from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. She will be presenting to us on using the core conflictual relationship theme with children and adolescents. Before we start, I'd just like to very briefly introduce to you the webinar tools. The first webinar tool is to raise your hand and ask a question. You should be able to find on your dashboard on the right side of your screen a hand raising icon. This is to indicate that you have a question. So if you want to indicate that you have a question, I will open up the microphone for you and you can ask your question directly to our presenter. If you don't have a microphone, or if you would prefer to not ask your question directly, you can type your question in the questions tab that's also in the dashboard to the right side. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or issues, you can also write them down on the questions tab. We'll have time for questions and discussion at the end and during the talk when our speaker finds it the most appropriate. So without further ado, welcome Orya.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. And the funny thing is that I don't see you and you don't see me. So we'll proceed this way, and I'll try to open the camera in the end just to say hello. So this is our topic for today, using the core conflictual relationship theme, the CCRT, in psychotherapy research with children, adolescents, and young adults. Here is the structure of our webinar today. I'll give a very brief intro of the historical background of the CCRT and how it's defined. Then I'll explain about the relationship anecdote paradigm, the RAP interview, during which we collect relationship episodes. Following that part, we'll have a few minutes break where you can make comments or ask questions. Then I'll proceed to showing you examples of how we code these episodes that we collected on the RAP interview. I'll provide the instructions and we'll go through an example together. And if there's time, we'll go through 2 examples. And then we'll have another break. And finally, I'll give you some examples of papers that I was involved in using the CCRT, conducting research with these different populations and what we can learn from it. And we'll have more time for discussion in the end. Okay, so let's begin. Some historical background. Lester Luborsky, a psychoanalyst, developed a research tool to test the Freudian assumption that internal representations of interpersonal patterns that were created with parents in the past during people's childhood are projected on the therapist. This is the concept of transference that Luborsky wanted to find a way to test it. He formulated with his team the core conflictual relationship theme and defined it as a recurrent interpersonal pattern that is unconsciously created and recreated in many of the patient's relationships. And you see, like the picture on the bottom, the diagram. So the woman has some image of past relationship and she's projecting it on the therapist. That's the transference. The therapist also has some internal images of past relationships, projecting it on the patient, the countertransference. Okay. Okay, and here I am. Okay. So Luborsky and his research team examined many sessions taken from long-term psychoanalytic psychotherapies, recorded sessions. And they discovered that when patients spoke about significant relationships, their narratives usually included these 3 components that they identified. One was a wish from the other person, some conscious wish that is spelled out or an unconscious wish that you kind of read between the lines. The other component is the perceived response of others regarding this wish. So this is actually the patient's subjective perception of how the other is responding to them. And then the response of the self, how they reacted emotionally, cognitively, and or behaviorally to the other's response. So the CCRT is really combined of these three. We'll see how we derive it. And this was the basis of operationalizing the CCRT. So instead of just saying in a broad theoretical way, we recreate past patterns, now there is a kind of structured way to look at a narrative and ask, what is the wish? How is the person perceiving the other? And how is the person responding? So some examples of CCRT components. So there are many wishes. There is a wish to be loved, to be seen accurately and be accepted, to be independent, to assert myself in relationships, and more. Examples of responses of the other loves me, the other is critical, the other is non-accepting, domineering, dependent, and so on. And responses of self, like I said, emotions, thoughts, or behavior are all of them together. I'm sad, I'm angry, I avoid conflict, I'm happy, I agree, I understand. So how do we go about getting these narratives, which we later code, and I'll show you how to do it. And from that coding, we derive the pattern, the CCRT. So the CCRT is derived from narratives which the patient or subject, and subject is for studies that are not using patients, that will focus on psychotherapy research today. So the patient tells about different people in their lives, as you see in the circle, romantic partners, acquaintances, friends, families. These narratives are told in the course of a structured interview that is called the Relationship Anecdote Paradigm Interview, or for short, the RAP. So how do we conduct the RAP interview? We have about an hour to do so, okay? This is what I usually take. Because I want the patient to provide me with 7 to 10 short narratives, kind of short stories about interactions with another significant person. And the interactions have to have some meaning. They have to be important. They're not necessarily positive or negative. Patients will always ask me, like, do I have to tell you something negative? No, tell me something that meant something to you. Interestingly, they mostly tell negative narratives, but they don't have to. So 7 to 8 to 10 short narratives, because as I'll show you later, we want to see components that are repeated in as many stories as possible. So if I would only ask the person for like 3 narratives, I would have a hard time kind of concluding something about the pattern. So 10 is a nice number, but I can also get it with 8. And I usually try to keep it just an hour. So in psychotherapy research, in the studies that I've conducted with Professor Hadass Weizmann from Haifa University, what we did, we usually asked at the beginning for 2 episodes about mother and 2 episodes about father. So we know we get our relationships from the past. And then they can choose to tell about anyone they want. Although if they're in a relationship, like a long-term relationship, I will usually ask them to tell me 1 episode about this relationship. Now, the narratives can describe an encounter from the past or from the present, and they should be no longer than 5 minutes, okay? So we're not asking for something very long. Just describe like an incident that happened, and we'll see the detailed instructions in a second. Now, with children, of course, you know, they're a little less verbal and it takes them time to kind of think about it. So you have to probe a bit and maybe be a little more active. The narratives are shorter, but I'll show you an example of a narrative from a child later. They're still really interesting. So these are the instructions when I sit with a patient. I'll tell them, please tell me some incidents or events about an interaction that took place between yourself and another person. And with children, I'll usually not use the word interaction. I'll say, tell me something about that happened between you and your mom. And there is no distant past, so it's usually fairly recent. I will tell them that the event has to be personally important in some way for them. And what's important here is that we have to ask for specific events, not a general description of the relationship. So this is a point I really want to make. The whole point of the CCRT is that they give you very detailed, rich stories. For those of us who are familiar with projective testing like TAT or other projective tests, you know, this is like something that has to come from them, and I want a story. I don't want like a general description of a person, because this is like their conscious way of dealing with it. Oh, my mom, she's intrusive, she's this, she's that. And it's very general and broad. And once they tell you a specific incident, there is usually much more detail and it's much richer, and we get to hear more perspectives of the person. So if they start like with a really general, broad description, I will kind of politely divert them and ask them to please give me an example of a specific incident. Okay, so for every event, this is what I tell them. Of course, I have to remind them. They won't remember all of this. For every event, please describe, you know, when did it occur, with whom, what were your expectations? Okay, this leads us to the wish. What did the other person say or do? What did you say or do? How did it all end? And how did you feel about this ending? And they usually get it. Like the first story is kind of hard, and we have to resist the temptation to give an example, because if we give an example of a story, then they'll kind of repeat that example. So we can help them kind of, you know, it has to be an incident, you know, something like a picture, anything, you know, like a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, but it's better not to give a specific example of an incident. So the questions have to be open-ended. And one tip I found with adolescents, when they usually have a hard time beginning, because I'm an adult and they don't really know what I'm thinking about or what I want, but when I tell them, look, let's try to think of it like a scene from a movie where you and this other person are participating in that scene, then they get really excited. So this works nicely with adolescents. While they're telling the story, while they're describing the interaction, you can ask for clarification, additional details, like where exactly was this taking place? I didn't really understand. Or can you tell me a little bit more? When you say you're really upset in the end, just describe it. Of course, with children, you have to ask leading questions. But again, leading questions that are probing, not one that, you know, direct them in a certain way to talk about specific content. So I will ask, okay, so what happened then? And what did your mom say? And what did you think about it? And was there anything else that took place? So I'll be asking more clarification questions and kind of helping them along. And like I said, we have to resist the temptation not only to provide an example, this happens to me with students in clinical psychology a lot, resist the temptation to interpret, reflect. They'll kind of go into the rap and start acting like it's a psychotherapy, you know, session, and that's not the point. We really want to get the patient's subjective perception. So a student can say, gee, it sounds like your mom was really unfair, maybe before the patient will say anything like that, kind of leading them in a certain direction, maybe the right direction, maybe wrong. So we're really just asking and clarifying. Okay, before I take a short break for questions, I'll show you a narrative told by a 16-year-old adolescent in one of my studies. Okay, this is a female, a girl. My mother asked me to babysit for my little brother so that she could go to the hairdresser. She asked me to be home by 4 p.m., and I really made an effort to be there on time. I intended to leave the scouts meeting early. She was a scout leader. But then one of the scout leaders, who's my best friend, felt really sick and went home. And I filled in for her for about half an hour. I got home at 4:30, running all the way. My mother was furious with me for being late and told me I was irresponsible and I didn't care enough to help out at home. She yelled while I tried to explain the situation. I wanted her to understand that I did care, but I also had to fill in for my sick friend. She didn't listen. She just rushed out and I felt terrible and I cried. Okay, so this is a relationship episode. It's very rich. And in a few minutes, I'll show you how we code it, what we're looking at, and so forth. But I can take a short break. And if there are any questions or comments up till now, you're welcome to ask them.
Thank you, Orya. So if anyone wants to ask anything to our presenter, you can either raise the hand raising icon on your dashboard or write a question on the questions tab. So we'll just give it a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm gonna pass the microphone to Adriana Margaretaz. Let me see if I can do that.
Okay. Hi, Adriana.
So, Adriana, it's telling me that you're self-muted. Can you see a few? Okay, there you go.
Sorry. So yeah, okay. I was
Hi,
just
Adriana.
wondering about the numbers, the number of relationship or relational episodes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Does it have to be that? You know, like do you have to get that number? What if it is only 3?
No, okay. So I'll explain because we haven't seen yet how we construct the CCRT. So I'll explain it and we'll see it later, but I'll also respond to you. What we want to see, it's a pattern that is repeated and recreated in many relationships. So we need to have a certain amount of relationship episodes with different people to see that similar wishes and similar responses are repeated. So let's say I only took 3 episodes, and let's say there is one different wish in every story. Let's say one wish appears in 2 episodes, okay? And then there's like different responses of others and different responses of self. So I have a wish that's repeated twice. You know, maybe that's important. Maybe that is the repeated wish. And I have different responses that each of them appeared only once. So I really don't have enough material to construct any CCRT. So usually with 7 or 10, you start seeing the repetition. And with a repetition, I can have a situation where a wish is repeated in only 2 stories, but then there is another wish that's repeated in 7. So if I had taken only 3, that initial wish that appeared in 2 stories may not even be something central. So I need that amount to see repetition of components, okay? And, 10 is the max. Most people, some people are slower. So, 8 or 9 is fine. Sometimes even 7 if the person is really verbal. But I don't want to create a CCRT on the basis of very little data. Okay?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, is that
Thank
clear?
you. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
So for now, Ori, you don't have any further questions, so feel free to proceed.
Right. Great. Wonderful. So we see this narrative. I'll get back to this relationship episode in a few minutes, okay? I'll tell you something about this coding system that was developed by Luborsky, Kritz-Christoph, Jacques Barber, and they have compiled, after many different trials and many different ways of trying to code these relationship episodes, they arrived at a standard list of categories and responses, because otherwise it was very hard to achieve reliability. So judges initially would look at the episodes, and I would say here, for instance, that the wish of this girl is to really be helpful and also wants her mother to understand her. Maybe someone else would have phrased it differently. She wants to be a good daughter. She wants her mother to see her. So it was very difficult to achieve reliability, even though judges may have been phrasing or noting the same themes, but calling them in different names. So in order to standardize and to increase reliability, there is a standard list of categories. And the book I'm using, I think I forgot to put it on the slide. It's called Understanding Transference by Luborsky and Kristoff. I really forgot to put it on, but I can email maybe through Alex, anyone who wants the reference. So they have compiled a standard list of wishes, responses of other, and responses of self. And for every wish, this is written in black, there are like components. There are like other ways that you can identify this wish in a narrative. So for instance, if there is a wish to be understood, it's very similar to being seen accurately or to be empathized with. So if I'm reading a narrative and I'm thinking, gee, this girl wants to be seen accurately, and some other judge would say, gee, she really wanted her mother to kind of be empathic with how much effort she made, then this would fit with the wish to be understood. And there is then a long list of wishes. I only showed you as many as I could get on the screen. A wish to be accepted, to be liked, to be open. The wish has to be a wish from another person in an interaction. So wishes like, I want to succeed, or I want to get over my difficulties are important wishes, but they're not wishes in an interaction. So the CCRT focuses on interactions. What do I want in relationships? And usually what I want in relationship is probably something I didn't get enough of as a younger person. That's why it's so powerful. So I want to be liked. As you look down the list, you see not to be hurt. So we can also have that kind of wish, and to help others. Examples of the responses of others. Others are understanding, or others are not understanding, accepting, rejecting, like me, dislike me, help me, distant, and more. Some responses of self. I understand, which goes with comprehends, realizes, I feel accepted, I feel approved of. So I didn't write all the components, but the ones written in red, it's just to give you an example that on the list of standard categories, you see the word understands, and then you have a list of like 2 or 3 other wishes that are sort of similar, okay? I'm open, I'm helpless, I'm out of control, I'm depressed, I'm happy, and I'm loved. Now the way it works, and I couldn't get a good photo or a copy of the scoring sheet to put on the PowerPoint, but there is like a list of wishes on the left-hand side. If you're an English speaker in Israel and Hebrew, we have it on the right-hand side. And then we have a scoring sheet that goes from 1 to 7. Here I am, I'll explain it to you now. And we use 2 judges to code most of the narratives for reliability. So the judges rate the wishes, they sit with a scoring sheet, and they look at these standard categories. And like you see on the slide, there are 35 wishes, 30 responses of other, and the screen is kind of blocking my my PowerPoint. So I think there are 30 responses of self, but you could probably see better than I am what the number is. And we really do rate every component. So what we do, we looked at episode 1, for instance, this girl with a babysitting story, and we go down the list of 37 wishes. And for each wish, we ask ourselves, is this wish like a central wish in the story? Is it spelled out? We're trying to make as little inference as possible. And like I said, we're not interpreting anything yet. So if the wish is not clearly spelled out, sometimes the wish can be inferred because it's really clear between the lines, but not really more than that. Okay, we can't really rate a wish that doesn't really appear in the story just because it reminds us of some theory or other. So we go down the list, and some wishes will get a rating of 7, some will get a rating of 5, some will get a rating of 0. And our rule of thumb, at least the one I'm using in my research lab, is that I assign a score of 6 or 7 when the CCRT component is really central in the narrative. Like if the person is saying something like, I met my dad for coffee because I really wanted him to finally get close to me, then it's very clear that the wish is, I want to get close, okay? So we give a 6 or a 7. We kind of discuss when is it a 6, when is it a 7. In the long run, it doesn't really matter when it's the high end of the scale. We assign ratings of 4 or 5 when we see that the component does appear in the text, but it's not really central. Like it's another wish that's added, but the whole story is really about something else, but it's there. Okay, so we can identify another wish. We assign a 2 or 3, usually when I'm not really sure, when we think a wish is there, but it's kind of weak, and we kind of see some clues. So we'll give it 2 or 3. And 1 we assign when the component doesn't really appear in the text. And like I said, the coding should be based on the text with minimum inference. Now, it sounds like a lot of work. It is work, but I have to say that once you get going, it goes on fairly quickly because you really don't spend that much time thinking about every week. We do a lot of practice training before that, and we try to reach like reliabilities of 0.7 for starters. And, you know, that will usually happen. And the closer we stick to the text, the higher the reliability will be. That's why I'm saying minimum inference. So the question is, why do we have to rate all these wishes and responses? Why can't we just look at the narrative and say, oh, that's clear, she wants to be understood. You know, let's just say be understood, give her a 7, there's really nothing else, let's leave. I think what we do, especially in research, because we want to see in research, and I'll talk about that later, if the CCRT changes, if some wishes that are kind of weak or medium become stronger, or if there are differences in the wishes towards different people. So if we too quickly jump with one wish that's really, really obvious, we may miss out on other more subtle wishes, but they're there in the text if we read it. And the same thing with the responses of other. For example, I've seen it happen, like let's say the other person is quite angry, but during this episode, the person also said something really favorable. Like let's say the other person was critical and kind of distant, but in the end they said something like, oh, it was really nice to meet you. Okay, so if I just look at the distant and the critical, and I get this general impression of the story, I'll really miss out that the other person, and the patient is telling me about this, also said something favorable. So I want to get the richest possible data that really reflects the task. So I really have to be disciplined and make sure I've gone through all the possibility. Now, these two judges are rating the materials separately. Of course, they're not sitting together. We do reliabilities, we do ICC every once in a while, and we look for disagreements. Now, since it's a 7-point scale, if they have a 1-point disagreement, it really usually just either reflects their tendency, you know, whether they're more of a 7 person or a 6 person, or sometimes they think something is a little bit stronger, but overall, they're really on the same page. On the other hand, if there's more than a 1 point, if there's like a 2-point difference, then one, for instance, if one is giving a 6 and the other one is giving a 4, then one judge thinks that this wish is very central in the narrative, and the other one thinks, well, it's kind of there, but it's not that central. So then they really do need to discuss their disagreements until they reach a rating that they both agree. Now, the point is not for one rater to convince the other. Sometimes that happens, but for the two of them to really agree. So maybe one rater kind of thinks about it again when he hears the other rater's points and kind of said, yeah, actually it's a 6, or they may both decide it's a 5, okay? But the agreement rating is the final rating. The other ratings, which are just 1 point, they're either the same rating or just 1 point difference, then we do an average. So we go through the wishes. The RO is the response of other, the RS is the response of self, and we kind of code every episode. Okay, now another way of working with this data, once we've rated the wishes and the responses of other, and it's also useful for research, is that Luborsky and his team also assigned values of positive or negative in relation to the wish, the RO, and the RS. Just cross that last line in relation to the wish. I'm sorry, it's wishes, ROs, and RSs. So if the person, you know, we could look at a variety of responses, but then we can look at all the narratives and say, gee, they're mostly negative, or they're mostly positive, or they're half and half. So we could also use that for some kind of research question if we want to work with positive or negative. So now I'll give you how I coded, and you're welcome. If you have other ideas of how to code this narrative, we can discuss our disagreements as it happens in real life. And I wrote in red sentences that I took from this narrative that I read out loud to you that described the wish, the response of other, and the response of self. And I only wrote the ones that got fairly strong rating. I didn't, you know, I don't want to go through the whole list now because it will take us too long. So one wish is, I actually started from the end because it was easier for me. She said I wanted her to understand that I did care. You know, she tells me I don't care. And what I really want is for her to understand that I do, that she's wrong. So that for me, when I go to the list of standard categories, fits with to be seen accurately and to be understood. And I gave that a 7 because I thought that was really strong in the story, that the mother kind of, we can understand why the mother is angry, being late or maybe missing out on her hairdresser's appointment, but missing out or perceiving her daughter inaccurately. But then I kind of reread the story again. And since I have to go down the list of wishes, I kind of noted the sentence, I intended to leave the scouts meeting early. And for me, this is like minimum inference, I think, not a lot, that I thought I could infer that she really wanted to respond to the mother's needs, which fits the wish to help others. She's not telling us in the story, I really didn't want to do it, or my mother forced me. So it's like my mother asked me and I really did my best. I wanted to leave early and I tried. So I thought I could make this inference that there was a wish to help the other. It's not as strong as the wish to be understood. So maybe the 6 here is a little exaggerated. Maybe I would be better off with a 5. So that's how I think about it. And I would be interested to hear the thoughts later. Now, the response of the other person. My mother was furious with me for being late. That's very strong. The other is angry. I'm taking that from the list of standard categories. And then she told me I was irresponsible and I didn't care enough to help at home. So there's another category, rejecting. And rejecting includes the components critical, disapproving. So I thought that fit well with how she perceived her mother's response. And I'm reminding you that the response of the other is how my patient or my subject is telling me this, okay? I may not think about it in the same way, but I'm coding the way the client perceived. This is subjective. Okay, then there is another response. She yelled, she didn't listen, she just rushed out. So that fit with the other hurts me, or the other is distant, unresponsive, unavailable. That's there in the coding system, and I gave that a 6. The response of self, I tried to explain the situation. So that was a hard one. I didn't find anything that really fits. So the closest was open, which has an explanation of trying to express myself. And I thought that was pretty strong. I gave it a 7. And certainly I felt terrible and cried, which fit with sad, angry, and frustrated. So the summary, if I look at this coding, is my strong wishes is to help others to be seen accurately, 7 and 7. The other is critical, angry, rejecting, and distant. And the numbers are, if I go back, 7 and 6. And I am open, and I'm also sad and angry. So for some types of research, you might only want to deal with those 7s and 6s. It depends upon your research question. But if you're looking to see change, like if I look at the CCRT in the course of therapy and I want to see what changes, it would be really interesting to see if these 7s became 6s and 5s at the end of therapy. And if those other components that I rated 4 and 5, maybe they all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden in the process, became 6 or 7 in the end. So depending on my research question, I usually want to rate everything, and then I decide what I want to do with it. So one question which comes up and also came up for us, there are these standard categories. They're very, very rich. But what happens if I read the narrative and I don't find anything that fits? So the more I work with a CCRT, the more it happens to me that sometimes something is missing. At a certain point, when we did a study with adolescents, for instance, we felt that the wish of autonomy, for instance, to be independent, appeared in a lot of the narratives as to be granted independence. Like, I wanted my mother to realize I am independent. It's not the same as I want to be an independent person. So we actually corresponded with Jacques Barber from the Penn study group and kind of asked for permission to add the wish to be granted independence in adolescents, because their standard categories were based on adults, and we kind of got that formal permission. So I think that's an option. I also think it has to be kind of used cautiously, but it is a question that comes up. What if you don't find something that is exactly what you need? Okay, so how do we formulate the CCRT? Like I said, we rate all the episodes, and then we simply count, okay? Let's say the wish to be understood, let's say, appeared in 6 of the 7 stories. That's certainly part of the CCRT, okay? Or maybe the response of other angry or components like angry appeared in a lot of the episodes. So we really do a count, and we say, these are the components that appeared that got us 7 or 6, and all of the stories, you know, maybe it got a 7 or 6 in 6 stories and then a 5 in another story, but we can see it's a repetition. And that's how we make up the CCRT. Now, just to show you what a CCRT looks like as a phrase, okay? We can tell a person something like, or offer the person, in close relationships, you wish to assert yourself and to be respected. Okay, so let's say these are 2 wishes that came up in many of the episodes. However, often others overlook your efforts and accomplishments and push you aside. So these are 2 responses of other that also appeared in many of the stories with a high rating. You then tend to avoid conflict, withdraw, and feel sad. So when we're not doing research, we use it as a focus in short-term psychodynamic psychotherapy. That's a whole different other topic, that the CCRT is also a therapy model. And we ask our patient to tell us these episodes, and then we present the CCRT, and that guides us through therapy. But today we'll focus on the research, and I can formulate the CCRT for every one of my patients based on their ratings. Or I can decide, since it's a research, I'm mainly interested in the wishes and responses that received a high rating. I want to see how they changed. I'm not necessarily formulating anything. So I think we have a little time to even show you another narrative. This is from my doctoral student who's now a PhD, Tamar Axelrod Levy, who practices animal-assisted psychotherapy. And we also called the PAN research group. We wanted to see changes in the children's internal representations. This is like in a 30-session psychotherapy, and I'll talk about that. That will be one of my examples of studies. But we asked permission for if we could have the kids not only talk about their parents and the therapist, but if they could also tell episodes about these animals that they're interacting with in therapy. And we got a really positive response. So Tamar interviewed the kids, asking them to tell an episode about one of the animals that they played with recently. So in therapy, okay? So this is a story about a snake in the animal-assisted psychotherapy, and this is what a 7-year-old kid is saying. I spent some time with the snake. The therapist gave me the snake to hold, and then I put him back in the cage. So the child is kind of pausing, so we have to probe him a little bit. And so she's asking, how did it feel to hold him? And he says, well, it tickled a bit, but it was pleasant. And then he's silent again. So what happened then? So the snake, I'm not seeing my slide, so I'll guess the snake was on me or wrapped around my arm all the time. But then he started to move and I put him back in the cage. Did you want to put him back? No, I wanted to stay. I wanted the snake to stay with me. But it didn't feel so good, so I put him back. Remember, the snake started to move, and then it wasn't that comfortable. I also played with him. I put him on my body, on my hand, wrapping him around my arm. I also let him crawl. He was crawling towards my head. Is this how you wanted it to be? No, I didn't want him to get close to my face, so I put him back. So you see with the child narrative, he's a little bit mixing up the times. At first he says, you know, I played with him and then I put him in the cage. So the therapist is trying to kind of get a little more detailed what happened. And he's saying the snake started to move and I put him back. But then he kind of recalls that he put him on his body and wrapped him around his arm. So he may not be telling this story exactly in chronological order. He's 7 years old. But when we say, how did it feel? You know, like that's a response of self. And did you want to put him back? That's like part of the wish. And also when he said, I let him crawl, he was crawling towards my head and the kid stopped. She's also asking, is this what you wanted? Did you want to have a really, you know, this type of encounter with a snake? And the kid is saying, no, I didn't want him to get close to my face, so I put him back. So I'll show you what I did, what Tamar did with this episode. So again, you kind of read the narrative a few times. You can kind of go back and forth. Actually, if you're doing a whole interview, and let's say you're not too sure about the first episode, but then things become really clear. And once you're in the 4th episode, you could say, gee, now I understand the first episode differently, and you want to go back and re-rate it, again, according to the text, but maybe something about the way the person expresses himself becomes clearer, you could do that, okay? As long as you're ready, you can kind of go back and forth between the episodes. So the wish was to stay and play with the snake, which he said. He really didn't want to put him back in the cage, and he also wanted to be close. The snake is wrapped about on his arm, he's putting him on his body, so he's kind of looking for a very close sense of play. And then in the end, when he's saying, I didn't want him to crawl too close to my face, that's expressing the wish to not be hurt. The response of the other, and it's important that we can sometimes get opposite responses, we can even get opposite wishes. It's great. Because we want to get the richness. So at first it was really pleasant and nice and it tickled me. But then the snake, I wrote, opposes me because most of the narrative is, or Tamar wrote, opposes me. Most of the narrative is about how the snake is moving and he doesn't feel comfortable anymore. And he's crawling towards his face. We could have used something stronger like hurting me, but he's not really talking about the snake hurting, but the snake doing something I don't like. So that's why she used opposing me. And the response of self, at first they feel very comfortable. Controlling, we kind of put a question mark, a sort of inference, because he's saying I'm wrapping the snake around my arm, like I have one way of playing with the snake. And then in the end, I'm sort of disappointed because it's not like this play is not proceeding the way I wanted to, and I just have to put the snake back. So another piece of information, and we'll soon take another break. Oh, I see I do have the reference for the book, the Luborsky and Kritz-Christoph 1998. So whoever is interested in the CCRT, that's a good way to start. They really explain the procedure and provide a lot of examples. So they have one more stage that can be used in coding the material. I showed you coding the really detailed categories, the 35 wishes and the 30 responses, and I think currently the list is even a little bit longer in the most recent list I have. But when we try to make comparisons between subjects, sometimes it's really difficult because their wishes can be sort of similar, but they won't be on the same standard categories. Like one person will say, I want to be accepted, and the other one wants to be loved. It's not exactly the same. So it's very important to be accurate when you're working with one person, but then when you want to make comparisons between subjects and you want to see similarities, then they have to be grouped on a sort of more general level. And that also increases reliability. So Luborsky and Kritz-Christoph have devised what they call cluster categories, where all these 30 wishes or so, 35 wishes, are clustered into a group of 8 wishes. And all those 30 responses of others are clustered into 8 responses of other, and the same with responses of self. It was derived clinically, but also empirically with vector analysis. So for instance, just an example, the cluster to be loved and understood will consist of several standard categories from the previous wish: to be loved, to be respected, to be understood, and to be liked. Now we can ask, why do we have to do all this work? Why do we have to go through the list? I explained that to you, not to kind of be carried by general impression. But then why do we transfer it into the standard categories? Again, because if we have many subjects, and I want to say 2, 3 subjects are really, really similar. And remember, Luborsky wanted to explore how he could assess transference. And transference is not always the exact specific wish from the parent transferred to the therapist. So maybe with the parent it was to be loved, but maybe with a therapist is to be accepted, and it's really, really strong. As human beings, we're sort of complicated, so wishes can be kind of similar, like from the same family of wishes, but not exactly the same wish. So it's much clearer for us to show patterns in research when we use the cluster categories. Again, we don't jump to coding the cluster categories immediately because we don't want to lose the richness of the data. Anything that's too general, I will very quickly lose the nuances. Yes, so it's work. It's not too much work. People learn to do it pretty fast. And so the use of the clustered standard categories is kind of helpful. Okay. Now, in terms of the rating, okay, we have to be loved and understood. But let's say across the board, to be loved across several episodes received an average of 6, and to be respected had an average of 5, and to be understood was an average of 7. You know, so we don't calculate the average of all these categories. The way which usually works better in research, I can say, is to assign that cluster the rating of the highest rated category in the cluster. For example, if to be loved was rated 7 across several narratives, to be accepted had an average rating of 5 across several episodes. And the cluster to be loved and understood would be rated 7. Now, why is that? why don't we just do an average of all these categories? So what I found in several studies is once we average everything out, we really, again, lose a lot of information. It's kind of hard to see change because everything is kind of reduced. And so, yes, I will rate it 7, even though it's the highest rated category, but my cluster will be 7, and it will be easier for me to kind of differentiate. Let me, sorry for a second. Okay, we'll just do 2 more slides and we'll stop for questions. Some directions of using the CCRT, both in quantitative and in qualitative studies, and then later I'll give you examples of specific studies with specific research questions. So like I said before, first of all, it's really interesting to examine changes in wishes, responses of others, and responses of self in the course of therapy. That's one way to look at it. So it also becomes like an outcome measure. Maybe the wishes at first, I can look at the negative positive and say they were really negative and then they became slightly more positive. Or I can say the wishes were really to be distant, to be domineering, and towards the end, the wishes are to be close, to be accepting. So that's kind of interesting. If I really want to look at it as some kind of outcome measure, I can also compare it to a control group. For instance, if I have patients in short-term psychotherapy, let's say a 12-session psychotherapy, so it's not too long of a wait on the waiting list. So we assess the wishes and the responses of others of all this group. Let's say they're all depressed. And so let's say their CCRTs look kind of similar. And then I look at the therapy group after 12 sessions. I assess their CCRT. And I look at the control group who's been waiting for 12 weeks. And we can see the differences between them. So first of all, it's a really nice way of showing change in internal object representation. Of course, we can try to see if those changes correlate with symptom change. If we have longer term therapy, and I'll show you again an example, Hadass Weisman and I did a year-long therapy. And so then you could do the RAP at several time points. You could do it prior to therapy, after session 5, after session 15, after session 25. And then you really also can see it as a kind of process, how it changes in the course of therapy. Like I said before, you could look at changes in the percentage of negative and positive components in the course of therapy. So that's quantitative. And you can compare 2 groups of patients. There are many studies using the CCRT, especially with adults and young adults, like different diagnostic groups or different types of therapy. And you could see unique patterns of change for different diagnostic groups. Okay, one more. You can look at the relationship between changes in the CCRT components and any outcome measure that you're using. So that's really interesting, and I've gotten that several times. I'll even show that to you with a study on children in animal-assisted therapy and also with adolescents. Since we're talking also about transference, we go kind of back to that. We can look at patients' CCRTs with a therapist, patients' CCRT with the parents, see if there is a similarity like Luborsky showed, see if the pattern with the parents is repeated with the therapist, see how they change, whether they change together. There's a lot of research from the 80s from the Penn Psychotherapy Research Group about interventions related to the CCRT and outcome. Now, we can also combine it with qualitative research and use single case analyses where we kind of do like a thematic analysis of the case, but then we can also show how the CCRT changes, especially when we have the RAP interview repeated several times during therapy. We may choose to use it as a qualitative, how the story is changing and how themes are changing in the narratives without necessarily coding, or we could do both. Look at thematic changes and also look at the standard categories. And another interesting use, which I'll show you an example of later, is use it in parent counseling. I've tried that, where you look at the narratives the parents are telling about the child before the parent counseling and after. And again, it could be used both quantitatively or qualitatively. So there are actually many, many uses that you can have for using the CCRT with different types of research questions. So before I proceed to examples of a few studies with adolescents, one with young adults, and the children in animal-assisted therapy, what the research questions were and what the results were. Again, I'm happy to take some of your questions or comments.
Great. So let me read out loud here a question that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two questions, actually. One is, what is the recommended minimum age for the CCRT procedure? And is it advisable to conduct such a study in a population of children with severe mental disorders?
Okay, so I'll start from the end. I think with severe mental disorders, it would be really hard, similar with adults, because it's, it's a task that demands concentration and also requires at least some ability to cooperate and, create some kind of alliance in the room. But with a severe emotional disturbance, you could have the therapist or the parent doing a CCRT of the child, like describing episodes of interactions they had with the child. I will be showing that. And in terms of minimum age, I haven't tried it under 7. I think it would be fairly difficult to do it with very young children. In the Luborsky and Christoph book, the one I had on the slide before, they actually give an example of younger children doing it in play therapy, kind of using the toys to construct an interaction, and they will ask them about what's going on. And then they did a CCRT based on that play. I haven't done it, but I recommend reading the chapter from the book. So I think with very young children, it's more difficult, but with 7 years old, it really worked well. I mean, Tamal had to probe them a little bit, but they were very happy to tell the stories. So if someone wants to give it a try with play therapy, that could be interesting to see how that works.
Great. If anyone else wants to give a question out to Orya, you can raise your hand on the dashboard, or leave a question on the questions tab. So we have a hand raised here by Mihak. Let me see if I can unmute. So Mihak, I think you have to unmute yourself. If you can see your microphone icon there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Mihak.
Hi, my question is regarding the example given for the child state. And
I'm sorry, Mihak. We're having a lot of trouble hearing you. Maybe it would be better if you wrote.
I'll write the question.
Yeah, maybe yes, that would be better. Thank you. So we'll just give it a second. Thank you so much. On the questions tab. And as we're waiting, if anyone else has another question. Oh, I'm going to pass the microphone to Elizabeth as we're waiting. So Elizabeth.
Or a comment. Actually, you're also welcome. If you have any comments or some thoughts about this, you're welcome to share them. And we'll have more time in the end.
So Elizabeth, you are now self-muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear? Yes.
Yes.
I wonder how you handle when the interviewer make interpretation or make suggestion. How do you handle that?
Okay, when we code the okay, and if I work with my students and I see that the interpretation really led the person in a certain direction, sometimes we will just delete that story because I'm not really sure if this is something meant to say or the student was just leading him in that direction. Sometimes they'll kind of make an interpretation towards the end because they really can't resist it. And, you know, the whole story was already there. So, okay, you know, I'll keep repeating in the training not to do that. But it happened to me a few times where it really wasn't clear in the story if this was authentic or something the therapist said that gave the person an idea. And so in that case, we just didn't use that episode.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we already have our written question here from Mihak. So for the child and the snake, you coded the wish to not be hurt. Would that be an interpretation?
Great question. I'm going back to the narrative, okay, on the PowerPoint. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, good question. I can't kind of go back. The PowerPoint is sort of stuck. Oh, okay, wait. For some reason, I can't wait. Let me previous. Oh, okay, I'll do it this way. Okay, I can't seem to go back. So, okay, I think it's a great question. I didn't think it was an interpretation, but we were concerned whether that was some kind of inference. And I'll tell you why I use that. The child said that the snake started crawling towards his head and he didn't want the snake on his face or something. Oh, okay, now it's working, so I can get back to the narrative. It says, I let him crawl. He was crawling towards my head and I didn't want him to get close to my face. Now, it would have been more accurate, or it would have helped us code it if the interviewer would say, what is it about not wanting him to get close to your face? Or why didn't you want him to get close to your face? Okay. But she didn't ask. But it certainly sounds like it's uncomfortable. The snake is crawling towards his head. He doesn't want him to get close to my face. So when I look at the rating, he wants to play with the snake and obviously doesn't want the snake to reach his face. So he puts him away. Now, I could say if I were working clinically and not rating anything, you know, he wanted this to play with the snake in a way that would feel comfortable. He doesn't want to feel uncomfortable. But the closest thing I could find was to not be hurt. Now, it's true that he's not saying the snake hurt him, but he's saying he doesn't want the snake on his face. So there was really nothing else for me to choose, for Tamal to choose from the standard categories. We thought that was important because that's how the interaction ended, by taking the snake back to the cage and not playing anymore. And maybe if we had a wish like I wanted to protect myself in the interaction or something like that, I would have used it. So I think it's a good question because it shows the dilemma of I see something is there. I don't have it exactly in the standard categories, but I want it to be there. And this is what she chose. And if somewhere else were rating and would have chosen something else, then we would have to discuss our disagreements. So this is a good example of how sometimes you want to code something that's pretty clear in the narrative, but you're not exactly sure where to place it.
Great. You have one more question here. Also, you mentioned that there has been research studies that have used CCRT for thematic analysis as well quantitative. Could you share the reference for that study?
Well, yeah, Hadassah and I did that. So I can't put it on the slide right now, but I'll be very happy for someone to write me. And it also had less to do with children. I did it in a sample of young adults working on countertransference. I'm actually working on a paper right now. And we looked at single case analyses where we worked qualitatively. Like we read, we administered rap interviews to young adults in a college counseling center 3 times in the course of a year. So 3 times in the course of the year, they had to tell us episodes about their parents. We wanted to see if that changed. About their therapist. We wanted to see how the relationship changed, and about their romantic partners. So when I could sit and read these narratives, I could pull out themes and kind of try to describe just from those stories, what was the process of therapy, if they talked about their parents and talked about their therapists. And I had 3 episodes about the parent for every time point, 3 time points, and 3 episodes about the therapist, and 3 episodes about romantic partners. So I can, if whoever wants to can write me, and I'll write you back, I think at least 2 papers where we looked at case studies, and we wanted to see if we could tell the story of how the therapy proceeded just from these rap interviews 3 times during the year, just by the themes that came up. And we also used the coding because we wanted to check and see, if the wishes changed. But it was really interesting to see, I read the rap interviews and I kind of created the story of the therapist by the 3 episodes they told at the beginning, after session 15 and after session 28, and the same about their parents and their romantic partners. And following all of that work, and we also had alliance measures and other measures, I looked at the therapy summary that the therapist wrote, and it was amazing how similar it was. So just by reading rap interviews in the course of therapy, and this was just 3 time points, you really get a sense of what was going on in the patient's life and in the therapy. So that's a sort of qualitative thematic analysis. We're really looking at the contents of the story. Okay, and I'll be happy to send 2 papers where we did case examples showing that. Okay.
Right. I don't know if we have
So,
one more question, Orya.
sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm going to pass the microphone here to Mark Beitel. Mark, you have to unmute yourself on your dashboard, please. There you go.
Oh, great. Thank you. And thank you for providing such a wonderful presentation. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about formulating conflicting or competing wishes within the CCRT framework, because it seems to me that in the first story, the girl wants to please 2 masters, and she's got conflicting wishes.
Right. So, okay. So first of all, that's a good point, because I didn't mention that the episode, the interaction is about a relationship with only one specific person. And so you rate it only regarding that specific person. You don't hear a lot about the interaction with a friend. So I'm not rating that. Okay. For instance, she could have told, in the course of the interview, she could have also told me the episode with a friend. Like I could have heard that I needed to go home early, but then my friend, felt really bad and she asked me to fill in for her and I really didn't want to, and I would rate that differently. So the way you can get conflicting wishes is, first of all, you could get conflicting wishes appearing throughout the rap interview, either with different people. Let's say with parents, there is kind of one wish, or let's say one type of wish with a mother, an opposite wish with a father. Okay, so that's one way of getting conflicting wishes. You could also get conflicting wishes in the same narrative with the same person. Okay, maybe if she'd gone on a little more, and even here, it's not conflicting, but there is a wish, sort of half inferred wish to help my mom because she did leave on time and it was important for her. But also, I need my mom to see me accurately. So I want to help her, but sort of she's also not understanding me. So you could have conflicting wishes in the same narrative. You could have, as you summarize the wishes, you could get conflicting wishes, and that's fine. And when you summarize, if you're doing the CCRT, like phrasing it, I've had CCRT phrases like, you really want to get close to people, but there are times when you really want to be distant. And so you have that conflict, and it's okay. Only in the story about the mother, you're only rating it regarding the interaction with the mother, because this is the person she's choosing to talk about, and that's the interaction. So maybe I didn't specify that. I said it has to be specific incident, only on one person, and you're looking only at an interaction with one person. And my sense is, when you're talking about pleasing 2 masters, that if we had the entire interview, you would see that, because either it would appear in other episodes very strongly, or you would just have a story of, wanting to please one person and then wanting to please another person and not getting along with them. So when you do the final count, you can get anything. So you can really get something very rich. Okay. Okay. Before I go into the examples, and I want to leave us like 5 minutes in the end, I think sometimes for research purposes and also to help the raters, and I think I may have skipped a slide here, so I'll go back to something that was important in the rating. Wait a minute. Okay, yeah. It's here, but I didn't say anything about it. It's the third point, so I just want to go back to that. Sometimes raters can really get carried away. Oh, there's this wish and that wish and another wish. So of course, during the training, I really tell them to focus on what's most prominent and what the patient is saying, but also a lot of times the way I try to help them is I will really have a ground rule that no more than 2 wishes can be rated as 7 in one story, and the same for RO and the same RS. So that sometimes helps them focus and decide what's important and what's not important. Okay, so I want to show you examples of 4 different studies with 4 different populations: adolescents, young adults, kids, and mothers. Okay, just to see the versatility of the CCRT. And so here are some references. So this is from a doctoral study of Dana Tzil Slonim, who recently achieved the Early Career Award of SPR. So in her doctoral study, she looked at changes in the CCRTs of adolescents in the course of psychodynamic psychotherapy. And she looked at changes in the representation of parents. She also looked at the relationship with the therapy, but this particular paper, she looked at changes in how the internal representations of parents were at the beginning of therapy and then 10 months to a year later. So she only had the before and after. This was done in a public setting, and they really didn't want her to do RUP interviews in the middle of the year. They thought it was too disruptive. And that's like another issue, that when you want to do research in the field, and you kind of have to go with what the site will allow you. So she did it in a public clinic, 30 adolescents, ages 14 to 18, in a year-long psychodynamic psychotherapy. Now, you can't really have a control group here because you can't have a group of adolescents waiting for, for a year. So what we did, we had a group that we called a community group that had similar demographic characteristics, and we kind of did RAP interviews with them at the beginning and the end of the year during the same time that we assessed the patients. So we conducted RAP interviews with the adolescents, and like I said, it was surprising. They really loved it because you're really asking them to generate material. You're telling them how important it is. They're your allies in research. And like I said before, I tell them, imagine these are like scenes from a movie. They really love that. So we did the RAP interview. So it really works well with adolescents. And I'm just giving you just a small taste of the results. Prior to beginning therapy, when we summarized the wishes across the entire group of 30 adolescents, we had a really narrow range of wishes, that received like a 6 or a 7. It was mainly a wish to be close and to be understood with the parents. Now, these are like good wishes, but when they're very, very strong in the narrative, then, and this was also how the narratives were told, that there's not enough closeness and not enough sense of being understood. So that was really very, very strong. And the ROs and RSs were all negative. All the 5, 6s, and 7 were my parent doesn't understand, my parent is angry, my parent is disappointed. Now, when we looked at the community group, this is not on the slide, but I'll tell you, kids the same age, we had a larger variety of wishes, not necessarily just to be close or to be understood. There was a lot of to be given independence. And the responses of others and responses yourself were kind of mixed, positive and negative. So, And these were adolescents with depression. So you could kind of think that these are like CCRTs of adolescents with depression. This is what it looks like. And following termination of therapy after 12 months, what we saw was really interesting. I mean, it's unrealistic to think, and I also think development doesn't work this way, that all the negative stuff disappears and suddenly everything is positive. No, they just had a more balanced view of the relationship. So there were many new wishes that appeared, and with the responses of others and responses of self that were totally all negative at the beginning, we now found across the entire group a balance of positive and negative wishes. And also the negative, the negative responses were not as extreme as they were in the beginning. Like, for instance, if a negative response of self was, my mother is hurtful, my mother is rejecting. So in the end, they could have, my mother is not accepting, or my mother is, you know, a little distant or not understanding, but it wasn't as strongly negative as in the beginning. But the important stuff was that there were many more positive responses. Now, this is exactly where the quantitative method works for us, because you could really see that the standard deviation of the wishes and the responses really increased. There were many more. And we could also see that strong wishes or strong negative responses got a lower rating at the end of the therapy. So we really did like t-tests and ANOVAs and got kind of significant responses. And the fun thing that doesn't always happen in research is that these changes were related to symptom change. We used the OQ45, and none of these changes were found in the community group. Okay, their CCRTs sort of remained the same from beginning of the year to the end. Of course, they didn't have any symptoms. So, you know, we could begin to think that these changes happened in the course of therapy. Of course, we sent it to one of the top journals and they said, well, you have no control group, so we can't accept it. But it was later, thankfully, accepted to psychotherapy research, which is not less top than any of the others. So this was a great research to do with the adolescents. I'll also add another result, that we looked at their relationship with a therapist, and the CCRT with the therapist worked in an opposite way. It started like kind of idealizing, the therapist understands me and is great and accepts me and all of that. And these were adolescents that didn't exactly, all of them, want to be in therapy, but maybe once they started, they felt pretty good. And then the relationship with the therapist became sort of less ideal and more balanced in the other way, like a little bit more negative. The therapist doesn't understand me. The therapist doesn't see me that accurately. So it was sort of balancing out in an opposite way, from highly positive to a little bit more mixed. Okay. And I think in one of her papers, she also showed that the changes in the perception of the therapist were kind of related to the changes in the perception with the parents. So as the CCRT with the therapist changed, the CCRT with the parent changed. You can't show causality, but the association was kind of interesting. Okay, I see it's 6:20, so I'll be quick. Another study we continued with Dana, and I did with Hadass Weizman as part of Dana's postdoc with Hadass Weizman. We took the same adolescent group and we compared it to a group of young adults that Hadass and I worked with, and we had CCRTs of both. Now we looked at these two groups as groups on a developmental continuum. You're an adolescent and then you continue to become a young adult. And it was interesting to see, first of all, if they had different CCRTs. Okay, they were all kind of slightly depressed and anxious, so the difference was not in two different diagnostic groups, but two different age groups that are on a developmental sequence. And they were all treated in the same place, okay? So you're kind of controlling for the facility and also psychodynamic psychotherapy. And I don't have room for all the results here. You could look it up in psychotherapy research, but the groups differed in their CCRTs at the beginning of therapy. So both of them had some depression and anxiety, but different wishes and different responses of others and responses of self. So their conflictual themes were sort of different. So as you could expect, adolescents were focusing on struggles for autonomy, And we really didn't see that with the young adults. And with the emerging young adults, there was a lot of conflictual themes, wishes and responses of other, when looking at close romantic relationships. With the adolescents, it was less complex. They were either kind of good or not kind of good. So it was interesting at first to see that they came in with different CCRTs. For both groups, there were changes in the CCRTs, and for both groups, the CCRT change was associated with symptom change, okay? So you could see that even if you're in a different age group and you have different, a CCRT conflictual theme, when you work on it in therapy, that still has something to do with your symptoms. Tamar's study of the process of change in animal-assisted therapy, this is a case study that hasn't been published yet, so it was just submitted for publication before COVID-19. So I hope it's going to become 20. And so she had like 10 kids in her study, and she chose a boy that really improved in therapy. And I'm not sure if this paper is about the boy with the snake or someone else. So it's an 8-year-old boy diagnosed with ADHD and kind of emotional problems and difficulties forming social relationships. And he received 30 sessions of animal-assisted psychotherapy, and she conducted the RAP interviews 4 times. It's really interesting and helpful if you want to see process to conduct the RAP at several time points. And in her study, the child was asked to tell 9 short stories. It was a lot, but they cooperated with her. I think she also gave them some candy at the end of the RAP, so they had some kind of reinforcement. So they told her episodes about mother, father, the therapist, and also about the animals. And interestingly enough, yes, I think it is the child with the snake. So when she went through RAP interviews at the first 2 time points, I think one was session 4, the other was probably session 12. This is a 30-session therapy. The wishes with the different animals, it didn't have to be the same animal. He talked about the snake, and then there was also a lizard. But so the initial wish towards the animal was to be close. And the child was telling about, lizards and snakes, animals that are not very interactive. And the closeness that the child wanted with these animals was closeness he could sort of manipulate or control. Like he would basically hold the lizard or hold the snake, and wanted them to be close and to be close in a comfortable way. And in later phases, the next 2 time points, he chose animals that were much more interactive. Like during the session, he could choose any kind of animal that he wanted from the therapy zoo. So he chose like rabbits and hamsters that were much more interactive, and he played with them. And then there were new wishes to be good to the animals and to feel comfortable with them that never appeared with a snake and with a lizard. And a very different pattern was found with the other kids as well. Now, interestingly enough, the responses of the snake was that the animal kind of oppose and reject, like the snake really doesn't want to be wrapped around his arm and doesn't want to play the way he wants to play. But even when he talked about the rabbits, for instance, there were episodes like he wanted to feed the rabbits and the rabbit wasn't really hungry. So the rabbit is kind of rejecting him. So we had rejecting in both phases, and the change was in the RS. So in the initial phases, he opposes them and accepts them. Later on, he kind of responds to their needs. And it looked like the child was moving from focusing on his own needs for closeness and feeling rejected when the animal isn't cooperating, to focusing on the interaction, on the needs of the other. And it's really interesting because these were children with problems with social skills, and you could see how the changes in the CCRT here too were associated with changes in behavioral and emotional symptoms, the YOQ and emotion regulation. And this is like good practice to learning to play with kids. And very quickly, half a minute, another master student of mine who looked at CCRTs of 12 parents of children who entered into a residential program. So the question before about kids who were much more disturbed, which with many problems. We couldn't do anything with the kids, but the parents were interviewed 4 times a year, because at points where they came in to talk to the social worker. And we saw that the perception of the child at the beginning was much more negative. Children were perceived as opposing and rejecting and hurt and angry. And the parents were anxious and ashamed and disappointed and depressed, really difficult. And this was associated with low parent competence and high parent anxiety and self-report questionnaires. And at the end of the year, so these are 4 time points, the kids were perceived as more helpful, more happy. Parents felt more respected. This was associated with decrease in parental distress, increased sense of parental competency. So you could really see the process of how the way the parent perceives the interaction is changing. And here too, it was very similar to a process that was taking place with the parent's therapists. The parent had to be in parent therapy. Okay, we have maybe 2 minutes for questions and comments. I won't read the slides. You can look at it. You see my email here, and any comment or additional question, I'll be happy to take.
Thank you so much, Orya. Yeah, anyone who wants to close us off with any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand on the dashboard or write a question on the questions tab. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Hadas, and let's see here. Hadas, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, wonderful, Orya, and it's just amazing to see all these studies with the CCRT with different age groups and with animals, and I think it speaks a lot to Laborsky's original idea and to your original way of studying this with different age groups. Orya and I did it with young adults, but here really it's very rich, and even taking it from parents. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. I think I'll turn on the camera for a second to say hi to everybody.
Sounds great.
Because I feel, yeah. Okay. And
there you go.
I think okay, I can't see myself, but I hope all you others do. And it was great spending time with you. And you're welcome to write me, ask for additional references, anything I can help. I'll be happy to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Orya, for the great presentation. And this webinar was recorded, so it will be up on SPR's Vimeo page, and you can also find it on SPR's Facebook soon. We'll be in touch for the next SPR presentation, so you'll get a request as always for invitation for registering. So again, thank you so much, Orya, for taking the time today.
Okay, and thank you, Alex, and thank you everybody out there, wherever you are, and be healthy and well. Bye. You're going to disconnect us all, right?
Yes.
Okay.